Hello, science enthusiasts. I'm your host, Jason Sikowski. I'm a high school chemistry teacher, but you probably know our dogs, Bunsen and Beaker. They're the science dogs on social media. This show takes what's best from their account, the curiosity and fun found there, and swirls it into podcast form. Every week, we're going to take some deep dive into an area of science and look at the research that's going on with our pets. We'll also have an expert guest who will enthrall you with their area of knowledge. This is the Science Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Science Podcast. We hope you're happy and healthy out there. The colors around the farm are changing to fall colors. It's really cute to see all of the golden colors of the popular trees and the crunch of the leaves under the dog's feet, and even the smell is changing. It's kind of that, as the leaves fall, they start to decay and it's like wet and musty. And I think Bunsen senses that winter is coming. All right, what's on the podcast this week? In science news, we're going to chat about ancient footprints and how that may be throwing a monkey wrench, not necessarily a monkey, but throwing a wrench into what we thought about when the first humans arrived to North America. This could literally cause textbooks to be rewritten, which is really cool. In pet science, we're going to talk about a really interesting way you can increase the retention in your dog after training. It's something that I came across this study, and it's something that Waggles always does. And now I understand there's actual science behind it. Our guest this week in Ask an Expert is Dr. Shelby Scott, who's a health data scientist. So we're going to get into the nitty-gritties of data and how that can help inform public health decisions or just decisions around health in general. It's really interesting. Hey dogs, I went to the Lindsay Thurber Learning Commons to check out one of our books to learn more about abdominal pain. But the problem is that somebody ripped the appendix out. Okay, on with the show, because there's no time like science time. This week in science news, we're going to talk about some new evidence that ancient humans in North America were maybe here way before we originally thought. Kind of interesting. Boy, I remember teaching when the Ice Age movies were out, and how like bananas the kids were for those Ice Age movies. Have you guys seen the Ice Age movies? There's like a sloth and a saber-toothed tiger and a mastodon named Manny. I think it's the guy, the Everybody Loves Raymond guy. People love the little saber-toothed squirrel, which may or may not be really accurate. That little saber-toothed squirrel became like the main character of the Ice Age movies. And when I had to teach about Sid the giant sloth, he's actually way, way bigger than that. They were a thing, and it blew the kids' minds. Speaking of the early people that inhabited North America, what does the study actually talk about? It's all about footprints, and the footprints that were left behind that are now frozen in rock, or they're the depressions in rock that now have become quote unquote mineralized. And they're called ghost tracks. And that's because they pop up and then they disappear. It could be just the terrain the people were walking over, or they walked and they left footprints, but it wasn't the proper rocks. It didn't save in the rock cycle. I don't know. I'm not a geologist. But they found these ghost footprints in New Mexico, and so the study says, they're 23,000 to 21,000 years old. Geoscientist Matthew Bennett and his colleagues have reported this in this week's Science. If this is true, that will have moved back the first humans in North America, like by 10,000 years. It's really a big debate when the first humans came to North America. We know humans originated from Africa. The genetic dating of all of us goes back to around that area. And as humans spread out, they really didn't have great ships, so we thought, to get across the big oceans, but they could walk. And the prevailing theory is that humans walked across the Bering Land Bridge that connected Asia to North America by a receding ice shelf. And this is around 13,000 years ago. This massive ice sheet is called the Laurentide Ice Sheet. And during the Ice Age, it blanketed all of North America. And it slowly, as the world warmed up, receded back into the Arctic. Now, there's other evidence to back up that humans have been here much earlier. They found tools and bones in a Mexican cave. They found 30,000-year-old human bones in a Mexican cave and stone tools from Texas that predate this prevailing theory of 13,000 years ago. So how does this new data stack up? At White Sands National Park in New Mexico, the scientists used a whole bunch of different methods to calculate the age ranges of these footprints. How do you figure out how old a footprint is? Like, you see a footprint on the ground, it probably was trapped in the rock layers. So can you use stratigraphy, where you like say, oh, what layer is this and what layer is that? That's tough to do. They had a really interesting idea. They looked for tiny aquatic plants that would be trapped in the footprint. So as people walked, they pressed down on grass, and it was kind of like, and they pressed down on plants around swamps, and the plants got stuck in the mud, and that muddy footprint preserved the aquatic plant. And then they used radioactive carbon dating to figure out how old the plants are. Now, other interesting things is that these footprints were found alongside the animals that I talked about in the intro, giant megafauna like giant sloths and mammoths. One thing that the team is excited about is that footprints don't move up and down the different layers of rock like bones can. Bones could be uncovered and somebody could dig them down to rebury them, and then now they could be in a lower level of rock, because the lowest level rock is the most ancient, right? Or bones could be dug up and moved up. The same thing with tools. Ancient tools could be dug up and then used again, or buried and buried deeper than when they were, but footprints are frozen in the layer of the stratigraphy. Now, there are some doubters that want more data from these footprints before basically accepting them as true. It's such a huge deal if these footprints, turn out to be over 20,000 years old, because then that will change and move back the time frame that humans have been in North America. Perhaps there was 2 different migrations, which is exciting. Maybe humans got here early and they also did walk across that land bridge. The team is hoping to head back to this area to continue studying the footprints and gather more data. You can bet we'll keep our eye on future studies. That's science news for this week. This week in pet science, let's talk about dog training. Dog training has been on my mind for a while. We run Tuesday Spaces, and we had Shar Mulligan, who is one of the trainers of Bunsen, and she owns Waggles in Red Deer, which is this awesome place to go to train your dog. And it just got me thinking about the science of training that they use. We always use positive reinforcement, but there's something that Waggles does after every lesson. There's playtime, and they actually really encourage you to have your dogs go play instead of just going home after the lesson. And I came across this study. It's not super recent, but it just twigged my mind, because I was like, I'm always thinking about training Bunsen and Beaker. I'm working on teaching them some new tricks, which is really fun. And this one just keyed in. So this is from the University of Lincoln by researcher Nadja Affenzeller. And they investigated whether play following learning leads to a better performance in the next day. The reason why they were wondering about this is that it actually helps humans. So after you learn something, if you go quote unquote play, it increases your performance the next day. So it's thought that in humans, hormones when you're happy, so quote unquote positive arousal, acts on the brain and the hippocampus and the amygdala, and it leads to better memory. So there's some kind of like hormone interaction there that zippity zaps in what you've been doing into memory. And this type of memory is called declarative memory, which is what we use for facts and events. For example, think of something from memory that you had to memorize, like the Americans probably have to memorize the states and their capitals. Canadians have to memorize the provinces and their capitals, and we actually have to memorize the American states sometimes. But anyways, that's declarative memory. It's tough to ask a dog a question like that, like what is the value of pi to 5 digits, right? We're not certain that dogs can understand that, or we can't really get them to communicate that way. What they have to use is tasks, right? Something the dog can do. Here's how the study went. Each dog had a pre-training session in which the dog was taught to approach an object. In the early stages, food was placed on the object, and when the dog approached, the dog was allowed to eat it. So they were kind of marking one of the objects with food. In this session, the dogs were taught to figure out between the two objects and choose the one by putting their paws on a cardboard square. So if they put their paws on the cardboard square and it was the correct object, the researchers used clicker training and gave them a treat. So it went from easy to a little bit more difficult to having to mark on the floor with their paws, and then they got rewarded. And the objects weren't things that the dogs were used to, I guess, in the study. There was a weird basket with polka dots, and the basket contained wood chips. And then there was some other box with stripes on it that had cat litter. So it's like they're using kind of bananas objects that dogs would definitely never see in that combination. And the dogs were trained in series of 10 trials until they got 80% of the objects correct, the keyed object. So regardless if the dogs did great, they had to finish a series of 10 trials. And they stopped the 10 trials when the dogs got to 80%. So if they were at 60% after the first 10, they did another 10 until they got to 80%. Now, right after that, one group of dogs was allowed to go have fun and play, and another group was allowed to go rest. Dogs were given a choice to play fetch, to walk around, play tug, like something stimulating that they like to do. The dogs in the rest group were just given a bed to lie down, and the owner and researcher just talked for about a half an hour. Just, some small talk while the dog got a break. So one dog group got to play, the other dogs got to sleep, and they brought the dogs back the next day. The dogs that had taken part in the play relearned this object discrimination task much more quickly, taking around 26 trials to get to 80% compared to 43 for the dogs that were given rest. So that's significant. So significantly less relearning in the dogs that were allowed to play. They also took a couple different biological tests. They found less cortisol or stress hormone in the dogs that were allowed to play compared to the resting dogs. And if you're wondering about what type of dog breeds it was, they were all Labrador retrievers. This was so that there was no breed differences in the study. So the conclusion is just like humans, after you're done teaching your dog something, let them play. That helps increase their memory and decrease the amount of time it takes them to relearn the task the next time. And I think that goes for humans too. Maybe that's why my science students do so much better when we do labs that are a lot of fun. It's kind of a play. That's Pet Science for this week. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to our show week after week. If you want to know how to support the Science Podcast, here are a couple ways. It's always going to be free to download, so you'll never have to worry about paying for it. But, things do cost money running a podcast, and here are a couple ways you could help us out. One is join our Patreon page. It's amazing. It's growing. It's almost like an extended family. There's multiple tiers of support, and we have lots of fun perks for being part of our Patreon page. The other way you could support us is giving us an awesome review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, anywhere you can rate our podcast. Give us a great review. The third way you could support the show is checking out the BunsenBurnerBMD.com website. We have awesome merch there. We worked really hard finding quality merchandise that's comfortable with vibrant colors. And you'll find in limited quantities over the next couple months, maybe even less, the 2022 Bunsen and Beaker calendar. So 3 ways to support us: the Patreon page, 2, give us a great review, 3, head over to our merch stop and see if there's anything there you'd like. Thanks everybody. Now on to the interview section. It's time for Ask an Expert on the Science Podcast, and I am thrilled to have Dr. Shelby Scott, who is a health data scientist, with me today. How are you doing today, Dr. Scott?
I'm doing well. I'm here in Tennessee in the U.S., and it is cooled down for the first time in what feels like forever. So I am enjoying that.
We complain all the time in Alberta when it gets hot, but we just don't know what hot is until you go south of Canada. So, it does get hot, but not like Tennessee, I'd imagine.
No, and it's all relative. So what is hot to you in Alberta is very different than what's hot to me in Tennessee. But that temperature fluctuation hits you no matter what.
This is true. This is true. You kind of covered one of my first questions is like, where are you calling in to the podcast from? Just a follow-up one. Are you from Tennessee? Like, is that your home state?
I'm originally from Alabama, so I've lived in the deep South my entire life, and would maybe getting out at some point soon just to experience somewhere different. But yeah, born and raised in Alabama, and then did my undergrad in Memphis, Tennessee, on the other side of the state, and then came to Knoxville for grad school, and that's where I'm at now.
Oh, okay, cool. And I was going to stop asking this question, but it's become super relevant again, and it's about coronavirus. Are you and your family doing okay with that?
Yeah, we are. I live alone, and so that was fairly difficult, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, working on my dissertation and being alone. But I have a great support network of people throughout the country, and we set up regular Zooms, and I started some writing groups that I found on Twitter,
Oh,
and
cool.
started playing virtual trivia with these criminologists and
Aw.
these public policy researchers, and just found my own little virtual pod, which was amazing. So doing pretty well.
Oh, it's good
Although
you
I'm
found.
sure we'll get into. Go ahead.
Oh, I just said that's good you found a community. Being really isolated like that was tough for a lot of people who either had to live alone or um, couldn't visit.
Yeah, and I think the hardest thing is not being in that physical space with other people.
Mm.
There's a certain kind of almost magic about being in a restaurant or being in a bar or at a music event that I think we all really lost out on. And even those who were with their families, there's not this communal vibe that you get with strangers. So I think I definitely missed out on that a little bit, but found ways to connect wherever I could.
Good deal. Good deal. Good to hear. So you kind of mentioned your education. I'll have you, if you don't mind, could you talk about that again? We always kind of start with a framework of who the person is we're speaking with.
Mhm.
You have a doctorate. You're Dr. Shelby Scott. I'd love to know about your academic journey to get there.
Yeah, so I was the kid who was okay in science and math. I did fairly well. I loved science and I loved math, but I wasn't good at it. And that's probably one reason why I got my degrees in them, because it was out of spite for my former self. Um, and for those teachers who gave me, like the B plus rather than the A minus when I was right on the curve. Um,
Ooh,
yeah,
shots
yeah.
fired.
Yeah, I won't mention names, but there are certain teachers, I'm just kidding. All of my educators were fantastic, but I think we all have that one teacher where we're like, "Ugh, just barely got to be in that class." Um, but I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon starting from the age of 8, which is young to know that you want to be an orthopedic surgeon.
Mhm.
But I was always the kid who figured out what they wanted to do and then stuck with it. So I was getting gilded copies of the medical journals for Christmases that I asked for specifically, staying up until 2 a.m., studying old pathology textbooks found at garage sales, total nerd stuff. Um, and so when I went to college, which I did my undergrad at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, small liberal arts school, I was ready to go on the medical track. I
Hmm.
was ready to shadow doctors, volunteer in ERs, major in biology, take the MCAT, go to med school, the whole 9 yards. And I had to take a stats course for my biology major, and just kept asking the professor, where does this formula come from? What is the background of this test? Why does it work? And I will admit that I was doing it to be a bit of a teacher's pet in my first year of college.
I love that you're so transparent.
I'm going to be transparent this whole time. This is what you're in for. He pulled me aside and he was like, "What's your math background? Like, why are you so interested in this?" And I told him that I had taken AP calculus and, advanced calculus and had done fairly well. And he recommended that I take calculus 3 the next semester. And in order to continue being that teacher's pet, I enrolled in calculus 3. And that professor saw something in me. She saw my potential to be a researcher and to kind of engage in this intersection between biology and mathematics. And she was in the process of creating the biomathematics program at our college and was not pushy at all about my desire to be a doctor. She was mentioning how having the biomathematics major would make me a better applicant for med schools because I had this
Mm.
background, and then just slowly but surely worked me into research with her. And next thing I knew, I was sitting there with a textbook about agent based modeling on one side and my MCAT study book on the other side. And every time I wanted to choose that agent based modeling textbook, I wanted to get into mathematical modeling. And the rest is kind of history. My undergraduate research was on this population of island foxes. So they're like the size of a house cat, but they're a fox.
Aw.
And oh, they are the cutest. If you ever want to like die of cuteness, look up the Channel Island foxes. They are truly adorable. Um, and so I started doing research on them and this population decline that we saw in the foxes in the late 90s or in the 1990s overall, and trying to figure out kind of what led to that. And got a couple of publications out of that, and kind of just realized that medicine wasn't what set me on fire anymore. And so I applied to grad school kind of on a whim. I mean, as much as you can apply for grad school on a whim. But applied to a couple of programs thinking I'll try out, I'll see what the application process looks like. I doubt I'll get in anywhere. And then I got into her alma mater and was asked to work with my undergrad advisor's PhD advisor. And so we get to be both academic sisters, and she's my academic mom. The academic world is a little incestuous, but we love it anyway. I got into this lab and decided to go for it. And I may talk a little bit about this later, but I wish I'd taken a gap year to kind of figure out exactly what I wanted. Wouldn't change my grad experience for the world, but I recommend to other people to take a little time before they get into graduate school, because I was burned out. I was exhausted when I got there, and then had to jump into these classes and take tests and start doing research. And it was almost overwhelming. So that's my little piece about, my little plug for people taking gap years. But started in the ecology and evolutionary biology program at the University of Tennessee, and realized that I wanted to make sure that when I got out, there was something quantitative about my work, and decided to simultaneously pursue a master's in statistics, which is something that you can do at the university, and developed this research project that was these mathematical models and these statistical models of the epidemic spread of gun crime in Chicago, Illinois, and just sort of dove into this kind of human part of epidemiology and of ecology, using some tenets from disease ecology and going from there. And, just absolutely fell in love with it. So that was my educational background. And then for the last 3 months, I've been working for a consulting firm as a health data scientist. And my current biggest client is the CDC. So I'm doing some COVID work for them now. So that's kind of my background. Feel free to ask any questions.
Wow. I like your plug for a gap year. Like some people, other people who've gone through the academia route, they put like expectations on themselves, maybe, like I got this many years to get it done. And so many people are like, you don't have so many years. You take the years that you need, and you need to make sure you're okay. So that's a good plug for that break there.
Yeah. I just to quickly elaborate on that, people say, well, if I, stop doing school, will I ever go back? And my response to that is, if you don't go back, you weren't meant to go back. Don't do a PhD just because it's the next step. Like, take your time.
Okay. So I do have a follow-up question. And you'll have to break it down for me. I believe it was during your, was it your master's or before that? You were looking at cellular automata modeling. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did.
Okay. You're going to have, that just sounds cool. Could you explain that to us?
Yeah. So cellular automata models are models that look at any process in both space and time. But the spatial component is discrete. So think about, a lattice of cells. So like Minesweeper would look like. And discrete in time. So we're looking at things week by week, month by month, day by day, even hour by hour. So that's kind of the background. And to give kind of a quick example that fits in with the science podcast, I thought about the analogy of sleeping in a bed when you have large dogs. So I don't know the sleeping situation in your household, but let's assume that Bunsen and Beaker are both allowed on the bed.
Well, okay, I'll tell everybody. People ask,
Okay.
Bunsen occasionally will jump up on the bed, and that is ridiculous because he is enormous.
Okay.
Right? But then he'll go away. Like, he doesn't like to sleep on the bed. I think he gets too hot because he's
Mhm.
a polar bear, right?
Mhm.
But Beaker, the little one, she sleeps on the bed, but at the foot of the bed every night, and it's super adorable. So
Yeah.
that's okay because she's like a smaller golden retriever. So yeah, your
Mhm.
analogy is like if they're both there, yeah.
Yeah. So let's say that you want to see some kind of patterns in how full your bed is on a given night. So how much of it is occupied on a given night. And so you take a piece of graph paper and you draw out the shape of a bed, and you have, each of these cells, and you have some that are colored in with human and some that are colored in with dog. And you take data night after night after night, and you can look over time and kind of see this pattern of how occupied the bed is. What happens on cooler nights in Alberta is, Beaker more likely to get on the bed and stay for longer? Or is he only there on Tuesday nights? Or when it's raining outside, is, Bunsen more likely to be snuggled up with you? And so, you can kind of look for these patterns in order to see what emerges over time, and in the dimensions of space and time, how full the bed would be. And then you can apply this to all other kinds of systems. So these models have been applied to wildfires. We have kind of this base layer where rather than the bed, we have the forest, and we can look at how that fire spreads from cell to cell over time in order to figure out where that wildfire might go next, or where we might need to put an intervention in order to keep that fire from spreading.
Hmm.
It's within this suite of kind of simulation models. So if you were a fan of The Sims or Minecraft, it's a lot of things like that. You're building a world, and then you're seeing what happens when you hit play and look at how the world you've set up plays out over time.
Cool. I love it. What a great explanation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so another question, and this has to do with your I guess your modeling on gun violence.
Mhm.
Um, could you talk to us about that? What did you find out? I I'm just so curious, because normally we talk to scientists and it's about animals and the body and space and physics and chemistry, but gun violence is really it's almost sociological, isn't it? Or did
Mhm.
you look at it from a totally different perspective? I'm rambling. I'm just so curious. I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah. So the model that I created wanted to look at kind of how gun crime spreads, particularly in the city of Chicago, in space and time. And Chicago is broken down into these 77 community areas. And that makes for a really nice application to these cellular automata models because we already knew what each of those cells was going to represent. And in a very general cellular automata model, you would look at how one cell affects another. So if one
Hmm.
cell has high crime, what is the probability that the neighboring cells are also going to experience high crime? What we also knew is that there are various factors that contribute to crime in somewhere like Chicago. And so this is where my kind of statistical modeling came in. I took some of the community data and looked at how these different socioeconomic conditions, so things like poverty, things like crowded housing, things like education levels, might impact the amount of crime that we see in one of these given community areas. And so we had a layer of that. We had this like layer of initial crime, of how much crime we were seeing in each of these communities. And then I got to pick these given rules. And this was also based on some of the statistical modeling that I did. But these rules on, how likely is it for crime in one area to spread to another? And how do the underlying socioeconomic factors contribute to that? Are there areas that aren't highly affected by crime because of these underlying socioeconomic conditions? Or
Almost like a
correlated.
vaccine, hey?
Right, almost like a vaccine. And so that was kind of the basis of the model. We were thinking about it like an epidemic and looking at how this, epidemic of crime would spread from community to community over time and through space. And while, I didn't have the opportunity or haven't had the opportunity yet to fully flesh out that model, the ideal would be that at one point we would be able to say, okay, whereas the government funding has been going to these really high crime areas, What might be more effective is if we put the money in the, medium crime areas, and then there will be this spillover effect that will help to kind of dampen those high crime areas because, maybe when you put the resources in the high crime areas, they just kind of eat them up and there's no results from that. So the overall goal would be to have kind of this actionable policy and these actionable recommendations of this is where and maybe even when you need to deploy these interventions in order to reduce crime in Chicago as a whole.
It reminds me of how we have ridiculous wildfires burning all across Western Canada right now. And that's like a technique is you create fire breaks, right? So the fire doesn't spread, and you may have to let one area burn, sadly, a little bit worse than the others to protect other areas. I know that's not the best analogy when we're dealing with people, but did your data come up with anything like that? Like, was this suggestion you're mentioning, is that backed up by your data in the study?
Not yet. That is a hope. But one of the things that did come up in our study is that this kind of infectivity parameter, as I called it, so that the probability of spread from one area to the other is the most important parameter. So I had things like poverty and unemployment built into the model. And we found that by adjusting those, there were some changes, but you would have to take poverty way down and take unemployment way down in ways that may not be feasible in our current system in order to have an effect on crime. But if you can kind of stop this spread and stop kind of the infectivity or reduce it, then we found that shows the most reduction in crime overall.
So one area has high crime, the other area has higher crime than it normally would because the high crime area is influencing this other cell.
Yeah, there's like this spillover that happens. And, if you look at these heat maps that maybe you see in wildfires or in, other systems, if you think about it kind of like a radar, you have these really high concentrations of crime, and then around them you see slightly lower, but still concentrations of crime. So, if you can find a way to prevent the spread over from one area to another, you can kind of reduce that crime in the overall city.
It sounds like this is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to be clear, this is just a model. This is not actionable recommendations yet. I just always like to give that caveat, right, in case somebody, then picks this up and says like Chicago's doing everything all wrong, and then suddenly Chicago is in my email inbox.
Well, it sounds like it's just a tool, right? It's like it's like, hey, this modeling shows this. This is one part of the puzzle to tackle a very, very serious subject. I don't want to say that Canada is immune to gun violence, but we always hear reports about some of the larger American cities and how concerning gun violence is there, or crime. And again, Canada isn't immune to crime. But it just sounds to me like obviously this is just one part of the jigsaw puzzle to potentially help out the situation.
Right. And the biggest thing is because of some issues with gun violence research funding in the past, there's not a lot out there. And so you will see these federal directives of, we need to do something about the crime in this city, and they will offer to send a certain amount of money. And then that city may not know what the best thing to do with that money is. And they're doing the best that they can with the information that they have. But by providing another tool and another place to maybe help them decide where to use that funding and where to use their limited resources, it can hopefully help them make more informed decisions.
That's you just recently had a publication in a journal. Could you talk to us about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I had a publication in the journal PLOS One, and it is a study of how COVID restrictions impacted crime in 3 U.S. cities. And the story of how this came about is slightly hilarious. I was in a text conversation with one of my friends who lives in Chicago. He sent me a text that said, is COVID affecting your data? At the time, I wasn't looking at anything past 2018. So, my response was, I'm not sure. What are you seeing? And he felt like there were more crimes occurring. He'd go out and see more cop cars. And of course, he was going out less frequently because of social distancing and some of these other behavioral shifts that had happened. But I was talking to my advisor 2 days later and mentioned that this friend had texted me this and he had this pensive look on his face and he was like, that would be a really interesting thing to look at.
Yeah.
We had all of these needs for social distancing. We had stay-at-home orders. How did that impact crime? And for anyone in grad school or anyone doing research, never trust your advisor or your supervisor when they say this will be a quick thing we can do. It's never going to be quick. It went from a let's pull the data and run some quick statistical analyses to a extra chapter in my dissertation. So a word of warning. But overall, what we found is that there were these dramatic reductions in crime, or these statistically significant reductions in crime directly after stay-at-home orders were put in place. And just looking at that, you can say, hey, we fixed crime. All we have to do is make people stay home, and then crime will be fixed in these 3 major cities. Spoiler alert, that's not the case.
Okay.
The next thing that we did is we broke down what types of crime were being affected by these stay-at-home orders. And we found that the majority of the crimes were property crimes. And that may be because people aren't going out. If you're not going to the grocery store, you may not have the ability to rob the grocery store. If people aren't going into their offices, no one is committing residential burglaries because there's someone there.
Mm-hmm.
If people aren't on the streets, there may be fewer, motor vehicle thefts and things like that. But where we did not see significant reductions in crime was in interpersonal crimes. And so despite the fact that the data may show some declines, those are not statistically significant declines. We can say that that might have been due to random chance. And so we were still seeing the same amount of assaults and batteries and sexual crimes happening during that time, despite the fact that people were at home more. And so while we weren't able to tease out the necessary mechanisms that caused that reduction, it could lead to some more interesting questions about how these, government mandated behavioral changes impact the way that crimes happen in our communities.
Interesting. I had heard, occasionally I would read a random media story from Canada, kind of alluding to that, hey, there's a little less people's houses are getting broken into. But at the same time, advocates for the safety of women in relationships are always like, this is a hard time if women are in a rough relationship because they're trapped at home with the person that commits violence on them. So I was like, as you're saying this, it's jogging some of my memories of things that I've read.
Yeah. And, this was only in Chicago, Baltimore, and Baton Rouge in the US, but I would be really interested to see what happened to crime in places like Canada and in places with differing severity of the restrictions that were placed on the populations. Italy was very much stuck at home, and they were fairly strict for a little bit, similar with Australia. Mm-hmm. And so I would be interested to see kind of how these waves of lockdowns and reopenings do impact crime in these different countries and in different states in the US, and different areas even. We looked at 3 bigger cities, but what was happening in these more rural areas? Were there any changes that were occurring in, the middle of nowhere, Mississippi?
Yeah, where I live, the middle of nowhere, Alberta, Canada. Mm-hmm. We were always at home. I wonder, that's so interesting because occasionally farm families will have their houses broken into when nobody's home, right? And I wonder how much of that happened because during the pandemic, people are at home. Now, I don't know if you can answer this. What was the lockdown like in those cities? Was it just to give you context, Alberta had quote unquote a lockdown, but you were still able to go get groceries. You were still able to do some things. just like movie theaters and shopping malls and stores during the worst part of it, they were shut down. Was that similar to Chicago? I'm just wondering for context for our listeners.
Yeah, so Chicago seemed to be a bit more strict. And this is why dealing with human behavior is so interesting, because it could be that the exact same restrictions were technically placed on the three cities, but the way that the populations reacted were very different. It was all kind of in good faith. We're telling people to stay at home. People
Yeah,
were
that was
not
kind of the Alberta one. It was good faith. Like,
yeah.
yeah.
People may have not been being fined or, put in jail for breaking their stay-at-home orders, but it did seem as though Chicago took it more seriously than Baton Rouge did. Or I won't say took it more seriously, because that's placing a judgment call on the way that, people were interacting with this. But the movement data shows that Chicago had a higher reduction in movement than did Baltimore and Baton Rouge. So that may be part of what is causing this pattern that we see in the data, where Chicago had a far steeper decline in crime than Baltimore and Baton Rouge. It could have been adherence to those stay-at-home orders. But it would be interesting to kind of know what people were saying about the pandemic in these cities, do some social media analytics and look at what the mood was about it. And then look at other cities as well and see kind of
grouchy. That was the mood. Grouchy.
Yeah, grouchy, grumpy, tired.
I'm
bored.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. I imagine that there are so many different things that can be done with this data that look at some of the mechanisms.
Yeah, Anya Radinaka, who was on the podcast, she's a biologist from Sri Lanka, and they had like, if you were outside of your house after 5 p.m., like the police could just like arrest you on site and hold you indefinitely. So like that was a completely different lockdown compared to, I'm sure Chicago wasn't like that. And I know Alberta wasn't. And then, looking at the data, like the criminals are not having to dodge like the police to scoop them up, but also people seeing them commit crime. So,
Mm-hmm. And then there were also questions about how police behavior changed during this time. If I call in and I say, hey, like somebody is breaking into my house right now or my apartment right now, and I live in a very cramped apartment, were police, more hesitant to enter into those places and to, report those crimes or fully carry out an investigation because of fear of COVID. There are all kinds of things that I just imagine occurred in this kind of landscape of COVID and of staying at home, and then also with crimes as well. There are too many variables, and that's what
it's a giant rabbit hole. Like I don't know, I could like pick your brain for 2 hours now that I'm thinking about all of these like separate questions, but I'm sure you think about it too.
Yeah. And these are the conversations that I get into. You talk about how people on the podcast talk about research animals and plants or the cosmos and all of these things. And coming from an ecology and evolutionary biology department, we would be out at a restaurant with people from the department and talk to the next table over, and they'd go around the table and somebody would be like, yeah, I study like the chemicals of ants and how that impacts their spreading of seeds. And somebody else would be like, I study garlic mustard, which is this invasive species. And then I'd be like, I study gun crime. And suddenly it was like everyone was asking me questions. And I was like, their research is like cool too. Like, please talk to them about their research.
Yeah.
Just because
it's more, like I don't mean to trigger people, but maybe there are people that are listening right now that are victims of gun crime, right? It's really personal. Yeah.
Yeah. It's incredibly personal, and everyone has a thought on it or an experience with it. And that was another thing that I had to be very conscientious of. Yeah, while I was doing this research, I go and present, and you never know the experience of someone in an audience. And the majority of my work is looking at the numbers and looking at the patterns. And it's oftentimes difficult to think about what each of those data points means and the experience that each of those people had, because it's emotionally overwhelming.
Yeah. That
My criminality.
your data points, and we're going to get to talk about what you're doing now with being a data science. Like all those data points are real people, just like you and me.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I did something when I started doing this research where I set up a Google alert for anything in the news that had the word gun violence in it. And this is something that I recommend academics do so that you know how the public is talking about your work. But, that meant that every Wednesday I would have this email, and it was a weekly digest of all of the stories that had happened across the US about gun violence. And I would pick and choose a few to read, especially if they were about, new laws that had been passed, but also just looking at the heartbreak
Ugh.
of gun crime and gun violence that occurred on a weekly basis was sometimes too much. That's when I would be like, all right, we're closing the computer and going for a run because we just need to get away from this. But for those victims, they don't have the luxury of closing their computer and getting away from it. And so, I had to have talks with myself about the fact that the work that you're doing is impacting humans, and you cannot separate the data from the stories.
Oh man, I know we were talking about data. I was so interested, and I'm glad we went down a little bit of this path for our listeners to, Canada does have gun violence. We're not immune from it, but I know that's the stereotype the world sometimes has for our American friends south to us, is that in areas it's just the worst. And I'm glad there are scientists like you that are taking the data and crunching it to make things better for people. So yeah, it is very, very important what you're doing.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience to do it as a young grad student. I did a lot of things from a not necessarily naive or ignorant, but it's hard to find the appropriate guidance on how to handle something like this delicately.
Well, especially when your colleagues are studying ants and mustard seed and not necessarily tragedy. Yeah. So kudos to you. Yeah, I'm glad. I'm very happy. I don't know what to say. Just thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a great help, and this is one of the things that I recommend to young grad students is to get on Twitter and get in the field in which you study. I was so lucky to find this writing group through Twitter of criminologists, and these majority women. We had some men and some non-binary researchers in our meetings, but we would just be able to have these conversations about how it feels to do this work and to be vulnerable with one another about the fact that, they had just run the data and found out something heartbreaking about domestic violence or about mass violence or about, incel culture. One of the main women in it researches, incel, involuntary celibates, for those of you who are not aware of that term, but she interviews these people and kind of how they got there. And whereas the media oftentimes demonizes this group, she sits in these spaces and listens to the ways in which they talk about the events in their life which led them down this path. And it's just a mess of emotions in order to have empathy and also understand that the things that these people experienced led them to do things that were damaging to other people. So it is just this, it can be a mess at times. And people who are doing work like this need support from other people who are doing this work and from external sources, because it can just be overwhelming at times.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Well, I think we'll transition into the next question, if that's okay, Shelby. Yeah. You are right now working as a data scientist, and you said you're working with the CDC?
Yes, I am currently working with the CDC.
All right. So what are you doing right now? And can you tell us about it, or is it top secret?
I mean, there's some stuff that I, may not be able to tell, but overall, one of my positions, one of my clients is the CDC, and particularly the maritime unit. So I am helping to run data analytics for cruise ships that are currently out and sailing, and looking at, the data about the potential cases of COVID that might occur, seeing about their adherence to the policies that are set in place. And so, that's one portion of my work. And then another portion of my work is with the quarantine groups. So, analyzing data for any quarantines that occur when they come into the US. And then I have a few other clients outside of the CDC, and that's looking at how different hospital systems serve minority populations. And then another group looking at CMS data, so Medicare and Medicaid, and seeing some of the patterns there. So I kind of have, my feet in multiple different health data realms. And it is just so interesting to see how all of these things add into one another and stack up.
That's amazing. Okay. Can we talk just real quick about cruise ships?
Yes.
Okay, because I have a million questions, but we only have so much time. Is there anything you can tell us about the data you got from cruise ships that you thought was interesting?
I think it's interesting looking at how, for me, as somebody who had a background in looking at, the spread of crime in these spatial areas, I think it is interesting to kind of look at maybe where people work or where they're staying, and, maybe the spatial patterns that we can get. And this is work that hasn't been done and may never be done, but something that I would be interested in looking at is, if I'm staying in cabin 47A and happen to be exposed to COVID, and someone staying in cabin 85E also is exposed, how did that happen? Where did that happen? Because cruise ships are fairly closed systems, they make for a really interesting study in kind of how this pandemic is spreading from person to person.
Yeah, they're literally a petri dish with people.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the fact that, oftentimes you see stomach bug outbreaks on cruise ships means that COVID, which is more infectious than many GI bugs, is a very interesting study. So yeah, it's been really cool work.
Breathe on somebody at the buffet line. Is there some air system that's linked? That's super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, is not work that I have done yet, but is something that, I think at least would be interesting to look at moving forward.
Shelby, one of the questions we always ask our guests for is a story about a pet in their life. Since we talk about science and animals, do you, and I do hear the jingle jangle of potentially an animal. Do you have a pet story from your life you could share with us?
Yeah, well, so many people are aware that grad students are not paid incredibly well. And one of the things that I did during grad school is I signed up for Rover, which, at least in the States, is a dog walking and dog sitting and pet care, all kinds of pets service. So what you're hearing in the background is a pet that I'm actually long-term sitting for while her parents are out of the country. And so while I was not in a place to get my own pet during grad school, or I didn't feel confident in my ability to give that pet the attention it needed, by signing up for this service, I got a little spending money, which was nice, and also got the ability to engage with all of these different pets in my community. So, I can go for a run and say like, oh, that's where Lucy lives. I wonder how she's doing. Or, I get text messages sometimes from pet owners being like, we just wanted to update you on Sophie. Like, here's how old she is. And so it was a great way to kind of get my own pet therapy without having to, commit to the responsibility of owning a pet.
Right, especially with you when you're so busy and if finances are tight, that's a double whammy for owning a pet.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Unless it's like a goldfish or something. But.
Yeah, just a huge collection of betta fish during my grad career would have made sense.
That's awesome, and that's cool that people are still contacting you. People that we trust to watch our Bunsen and Beaker. like there are, I have human kids. People know that I have two human children. But Bunsen and Beaker are our kids too. So you cherish those animals, and there's a lot of trust given to people that watch your animals. So that's cute that you obviously made a connection with those people and the animals for them to, say, hey, the so-and-so's doing great.
Yeah. And I live in a small enough town, or a small enough city, I guess it's technically a city, where sometimes I'll be out for a walk and run into an owner and a pet that I've sit for previously. And it's just the cutest thing to be able to, interact with those pets in the real world.
Aw, that is adorable. What's this thing called? Rover? Rover.
Yes.
I have never heard of this.
I'm not
Sounds
sure
like
whether it's
Airbnb for dogs, sort of.
I mean, it basically is. And as a sitter, you can set up your parameters for how far you're willing to go, whether you're comfortable having pets stay in your home, whether you're comfortable going to their home and staying with pets, types of pets you're comfortable caring for. And then it's almost like, I don't want to call it like a dating app because that feels a little skeezy, but
swipe right or left on the animals.
But I would be contacted by someone who was like, we got this new puppy and she needs to go out a little more frequently than our work schedules allow. Yeah. And then I just got to go and snuggle a puppy in between running data analytics.
Oh my goodness. I don't have time for this, but I would make time maybe if I could go let puppies out at certain time. No, I don't have time for that, but it sounds cute.
Oh, very cute and very fun. And another thing that I do on the side is that I run marathons and ultra marathons. And so I kind of came up with this network of training partners where I would run from my house to someone that I sit for's house and grab their dog and do 3 or 4 miles with that one, and then run to the next house and run 3 or 4 miles with that one.
Brilliant.
And, get my training in while caring for their pets.
Be in wicked awesome shape, and the dogs would love it. especially dogs that love to run, like shepherds and retrievers.
Oh yeah, there's one there's one Aussie that I spent.
The Australian shepherds are just they love to run. I love it. Thanks for sharing that, Shelby. That's amazing.
Yeah.
The other question we ask our guests for is something called the super fact. And the super fact is something that that when you tell people, it kind of blows their mind a bit. And we've never interviewed somebody like you before, so my mind has already been blown dozens of times talking to you. Do you have a super fact saved for us from what we've chatted before?
Yeah. Well, so my super facts are kind of depressing. But one is that we don't know how many guns are in the United States. And that's not due to, illegal gun trafficking. That is just the fact that data is not available to researchers. So we have no way to track the number of guns, and we can use kind of these proxies and we can estimate and extrapolate, but we don't know how many guns there are in the US. And then the second fact is that because of an amendment that was passed in 1996, and then the fallout from that, gun violence is the second least researched cause of death in the United States when adjusted for mortality. So the only thing that is less studied than gun violence is accidental falls. And so, again, a depressing fact, but it is just an underfunded and understudied topic. So if anyone listening is looking for something to work on, it's going to be a difficult field, but I definitely recommend looking into it.
And we try to stay a little bit out of politics on the podcast. Mm-hmm. I would hazard a guess that is something to do with a large lobbying group in the United States.
Yes, we are going to leave it at that, but yes.
Okay. Aside from being slightly sad, those are great facts for people to know, right? The more you know, right? With the rainbow thing flying across the screen, the more you know. Yeah. So the last question is a fun one, and it's a really good one because we get to know you more as a person, as opposed to this data scientist. And it's the important to you section, things you're passionate about, things that you care about. Folks have talked about their hobbies or causes that they are really big into. And you wanted to chat about mental health.
Yeah. One of the things that I was already passionate about going into grad school, but just became more passionate about was kind of mental health in academia. It is this space where we are expected to work all the time, and your worth is connected to how much you publish and how many hours you spend doing work and how many weekends you forgo that trip with your family in order to run stats. And it is just a place that has the ability to become incredibly toxic.
Hmm.
And it's something that we have been talking about more, but a lot of students don't know that their universities likely have mental health services available to them for free, and that there are multiple different networks by which they can get mental health service. And something that I was told very early in my grad career is that going to a therapist or a counselor once a year is just like taking your car in for a tune-up.
Hmm.
Even if nothing's really wrong, just making sure that all the systems are running is so important.
Hmm.
And by talking about the mental health struggles early on, that means that we can maybe reduce some of this toxic academic culture moving forward. I'm encouraged by the fact that a lot of people in my cohort and who graduated with me and around me are thinking about these things and are thinking about work-life balance and are then taking those into their future labs and into their future work. So
You're speaking on like the culture of work, 70 hours a week. You're always doing research. You're always on kind of thing while you're in academia.
right, always being on. And this is something that I faced a lot during grad school is I would be trying to work, but my friends would be out doing things. And so I would be burnt out, but feeling like I needed to still work. And then when I did put my work down, I would go out, but I would feel like I needed to be at home
You
doing
felt
my
guilty.
research. And yeah, there was just this constant feeling of guilt and this feeling of not doing enough. And some of that comes in with imposter syndrome, which again is being talked about more
Mhm.
in academic circles, but just trying to unlearn these, almost academic intergenerational patterns of constantly working. And I went through it, so you have to go through it. And
Yeah.
I didn't sleep for the 3 weeks leading up to my defense, so you shouldn't either. The hope is that we can kind of undo some of this moving
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah. That's just gross. I'm glad there's a culture change. I cannot speak from experience. I have 2 undergrad degrees. I did not go past that, and I have a lot of respect for people that do. My wife has a master's, and it was a lot of work for her to get through that. So, I'm glad that there's people in academia talking about that, and folks like you being advocates. So that's amazing for people following in your footsteps.
And, we do see it in undergrad too. I imagine that, everyone had the experience of the night before finals and it's like, well, I only slept 2 hours. Oh, you slept 2 hours? Like I didn't sleep at all. Like
Oh, the
this is
one-upmanship.
the thing.
Yeah.
This is, it starts very early. And the science, I mean, like the psychology does not line up with the fact that you test well when you haven't slept. But
No.
there's this culture of like, if you aren't pushing yourself to your physical limits, you're not working hard enough. And that is just absurd from the like neuropsychological standpoint. um,
Yeah, exactly. We try and talk about, like, because I teach high school, we talk about test preparedness, right? Our grade 12s, the last, I'm not sure what that is in the States. You have like different names for the last your kids are in high school. They have
yeah,
these,
seniors, but yeah.
seniors, right? Yeah, you have like I don't know. I don't know it's a thing in teen dramas to be like, I'm a sophomore, and people in Canada are like, what is this? What is that even? Anyways, the seniors are grade 12s. They have a government test called the diploma. So it's a
Mhm.
big test. It's worth a lot of their marks. The universities look at it. It's like I don't know, the SATs in the States, sort of. I'm
Mhm.
not sure if that's a direct comparison or not. So we talk about
Yeah.
test preparedness, and the worst thing you can do, the data says, is like cram the night before. Absolute worst. Absolute
Mhm.
worst. There's only so many hours, then or the rest of that information, unless you are the 1% of kids it works for, you don't remember it. So yeah.
Yeah, and this is another cause that I'm passionate about is how we teach quantitative biology and interdisciplinary science as a whole. And some of the things that we talk about is how we teach our high schoolers, and the fact that not one way works for every student, but we're expected to teach one way,
Oh,
and that we sometimes do a disservice to our students by telling them that this is the only way to do things. So yeah, I could rant about the way that we teach students forever. um, but it is this culture of you have to constantly be working. I even felt it in high school trying to get into college, of if you don't have 14 extracurriculars and also great grades and great standardized test scores, then you're not going to make it.
and you volunteer and blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
Right. And also, for your sanity, also have a social life and make sure that you have friends and
Yeah.
do your chores around the house and make sure that you're nice to your siblings and your parents. Like it, it's all too much.
Yeah. It's way too much. Well, I'm on your side. I know I'm not in academia. I'm in high school, but we're fighting the fight there to improve the work-life balance of our kids too. Or the life balance. Yeah. It's important. Mental health is such a big deal. And I'm just glad we're talking about it more. Yeah.
It starts so young, and, kind of the only way to manage it in a lifelong way is to start very early and to talk about these things early on. And, I think we're moving in some really great directions.
I agree. Yep. There's just ramped up the amount of people speaking openly about mental health. You have a famous Olympian that just, Simone
Biles.
Biles, right. You're the American gymnast. She pulled out of the events because she's focusing on her mental health. Like, that's huge. That wouldn't have happened 5-10 years ago. Nobody would have even talked about it. They would have said that they were injured. They were physically injured. They would have lied about it. I guarantee you that's what would have happened before. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. Or they would have been forced to do the competition. Yeah. And particularly in Simone's case, she had what gymnasts call the twisties, and there are some great Twitter threads on it. And I grew up as a gymnast, so I've experienced this as well. But you kind of lose yourself in the air, and then your like mental connection to your body just gets completely thrown out of whack. Somebody on Twitter explained it as you're driving a car and suddenly you forget how to drive a car, but you're on the road and you have to remember which pedal does what and how to turn the steering wheel and what the traffic laws are while you're driving the car. And it's just this terrifying moment that occurs. And, if that happens during one skill and then you have to go back the next day, there's a lot of fear that goes into that.
Well, it's dangerous too. Like, I played basketball. If you forget how to play basketball, if you forget how to shoot a ball, you just airball it and everybody's like, meh, right? But if you forget how to do bouncing in the air and backflips, you could kill yourself. Like, it's so dangerous. So, it's, I feel that people have supported this decision, whereas like 5 to 10 years ago, it would have been what? Like, there wouldn't have been the same kind of support. And those that are picking at her have been basically ostracized as being great big a-holes. So anyways.
Yes, the conversations are there and the cultural shifts are occurring. It's just understanding how that culture exists in your field and in your discipline, and the small steps you can take in your own life and the small steps you can take in the conversations you have with others in that field in order to make these small incremental changes.
What a great conversation and a way to end our interview. This has been really uplifting, this conversation with you. Thanks for talking about mental health.
Yes, absolutely. I will rant about it at any point. So if anybody wants to talk, hit me up.
We all have our soapboxes, and it's important too. Yeah. We're at the end of the interview, Dr. Scott. First off, well, thank you for giving up your time to talk to me. This has been fantastic. I've been enthralled and shocked, but it's smiling and laughing at the parts that are uplifting and humorous. So thank you for giving up your time. The second thing is, can people follow you on social media? Do you have a website? Do you have a Twitter account?
Yes, and I try and make it easy. So my Twitter is Shelby_M_Scott. And then my academic website is ShelbyMScott at github.io. But that website is also in my Twitter profile. So feel free to follow me on Twitter, check out my academic website, shoot me an email if you find anything interesting. Please be kind, is the other thing. I am just a human. So if you have a big thing to say about my research, at least phrase it in a kind way.
Yeah, we're only human.
Yes.
Except for Bunsen and Beaker.
Yes. Well, they're half human. I mean, they're basically your children. So
exactly. It's been my pleasure to talk to you. All of your links to your Twitter profile and your website, they will be in the show notes. So folks, you just got to check those out and click away. So one more time, thank you, Dr. Scott, for taking your time to talk to us about science.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a blast.
It has.
All right. It's time for story time with me, Adam. If you don't know what story time is when we talk about stories that have happened within the past 1 or 2 weeks. You know what? I'll start. Mom and Dad had just left the house to do, I think they were going to go work out or something. And I was home alone with the dogs. And it happens a little bit, kind of often. Sometimes the dogs get a few treats or a little bit of food because I mess up and drop it on the ground accidentally. But they like being home alone with me because it's fun. So basically, if you don't know what happens with dogs, is most dogs, especially Berners, will get like a favorite person. Like they'll attach to their favorite person. Bunsen's favorite person is Mum. Mum is Bunsen's favorite person, and Beaker doesn't really have a favorite person. Anyway, when Mum's gone and Dad's gone, I'm the new favorite person. So I got to deal with Bunsen's toddler time, which is when he's very needy and wants pets. I didn't do a good job of that. I was laying down on the couch. He sat down next to me. I didn't pet him for 3 seconds, and then he punched me in the face. Because that's something that he does. He like lifts his paw and like taps you. But no, he just full on sucker punched me because I wasn't petting him. So yeah, Beaker was very well behaved. She was very smiley, just sitting down like a little Beaker. Sorry, I looked at her and she's eating peanut butter.
You're eating peanut butter out of a cone. She looks like a weirdo. She does look weird.
She's not even moving her head.
Her paw.
She's also not moving her head. She's just staying there.
She looks weird.
Anyway, so
Stop that.
Yeah, that's sorry, that's chaotic podcast. But yeah, Mom, do you have a story?
I sure do. My story has to do with Bunsen being a little bit grumpy. So we're finding out that he likes everything to be calm. And this could be a direct result of me being home with him every day, all day, and he really just has to lay there. He doesn't have to do anything. Although he does get excited when Purelator or FedEx or Amazon comes to the door. He gets bark, 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 and he gets excited. But most of the time he's pretty chill. So he doesn't like it when you run. He's like, stop running. And we kind of noticed this a little bit when we were playing with Beaker, and Jason would just grab Beaker and say, come here. And then Adam also does the same because they can just scoop her up. And then Bunsen's like, bark, 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 bark. He doesn't like it. He just wants everything to be calm and low energy. So today I ran in the house and I ran around and he was like running and slipping because we have hardwood/tile. And then I jumped on the bed and Beaker launched herself and scratched my face. And then I thought, oh no, I'm Harvey dented, but it wasn't bad. And then Bunsen was like just telling us, calm down. No running. It's like a carnival ride at the Westerner, which is like our local fair. And there's a mechanical voice that says, walk, don't run. Walk, don't run. And Duncan, our eldest, just loved that ride. He would just go on, and it's not even a ride. You walk through it like a haunted house, but obstacle course, more like obstacle course for kids. But so you would go up the stairs, and there would be like mechanical parts, and the floor would be moving, and then you would look at yourself in the distorted mirrors, and then you would slide down the slide, and then you would do it all over again. Walk.
You must have done that 100 times.
Don't run. Yeah, Duncan was enthralled with it. And so that just reminds me of Bunsen. Bark, bark, bark means walk, don't run. And that's my story.
It was the best of times. It was the Beakerest of times. Yeah. So, Dad, do you have a story?
I've had a tiny bit of spare time now that I'm not going bananas building costumes, because that's over, to get back to something that I actually really enjoy, and that's designing merch for the dogs. I've taught myself Photoshop, and I'm getting better at it. And we just got the shipment of the new merch in, and it's all so cute. So I guess I'm plugging our merch, but I'm also talking about something that I enjoy doing. Aside from that, the only dog story I have to tell you is taking the dogs through the falling leaves and the colors and the crunch. I mentioned this last week. Is so rewarding. Like, it's just the best part of, it's not the best part of my day, but it is a highlight of my day when I get to come home and take the dogs on a walk down through the creek. It's not too hot, and there's that constant breeze that we get. It's great.
And we saw the owl 2 days in a row.
We saw the owl 2 days in a row. Yep. The dogs can't see the owl. They're invisible to dogs. I don't know what it is. Unless the owl's flying and they actually see it fly, dogs can't see owls. They're just like invisible. Okay, back to you, Adam.
All right, so that is story time. I'm very happy that you guys tuned in this time, but story time is over. I hope to see you guys next time on the podcast. Bye-bye.
That's the end of another Science Podcast episode. Thanks for coming back week after week to listen to us. Special thanks to Dr. Shelby Scott, who talked to us about gun violence data and COVID data and how all of that can be used to promote better policy. Thanks, Dr. Scott. I'd also like to give a special shout out to our top tier patrons on Patreon. If you want to hear your name read at the end of the podcast, head over to the Patreon page and sign up. Take it away, Chris.
Samantha Dodd, Kimberly Bond, Nate Stevenson, Debbie Anderson, Courtney Proven, Renee Hardy, Mary Rader, Shelby Leggett, Dan Fry, Mary Coos, Katla Lynch, Marianne McNally, Andrea Persons, Elizabeth Bourgeois, Karen Beth St. George, Bianca Hyde, Lynn Armstrong, Lisa Swartz, Catherine Jordan, Donna Craig, Lila Ashier, Jody Ogren, Liz Button, Kathy Zerker, and Ben Rathert.
Let's close with the dog's motto: for science, empathy, and cuteness.